Welcome to World War II On Topic. I'm Jeremy Collins, the Director of Conferences and Symposia at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. This episode is brought to you by the museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. Today we are traveling back to a 2020 Meet the Author webinar between our own research historian Jason Dawsey and Dr. Victoria Grazia, the Moore Collegiate Professor of History at Columbia University and author of The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy. Dr. Grazia discussed her book, which tells the story of fascist Attilio Teruzzi, a war hero turned commander of Mussolini's Black Shirts, and how the personal became political in the fascist quest for manhood and power.
I want to welcome all of our viewers out there for joining us for today's webinar. We are so fortunate to have as our guest today, Professor Victoria Grazia. She is Moore Collegiate Professor of History at Columbia University, where she's been since 1994. She has published on a wide array of topics, including empire and consumption, but she's certainly one of the foremost authorities on fascist Italy. And I thought I would note a few of her publications before we move to the subject of today's webinar. Some of these include The Culture of Consent, Mass Organization of Leisure in Fascist Italy, 1981, How Fascism Ruled Women, Italy, 1922 to 1945, which appeared in 1992. A hugely influential volume, The Sex of Things, Gender and Consumption in Historical Perspective, that she edited in 1996, and Irresistible Empire, America's Advance Through 20th Century Europe from 2005. We're so fortunate to have her today talking with us about a brand new book. It's coming out with Harvard University Press with a very provocative title, The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy. She is joining us today from Italy. Victoria, we're also envious of you being able to enjoy autumn in Tuscany. And thank you so much for joining us. I thought I would just very briefly mention something about the subject of this book, The Perfect Fascist. And I know you would like to give a brief overview before we get into our conversation proper. This is a book about one of Benito Mussolini's chief subordinates, Attilio Teruzzi. His dates are 1882 to 1950. And I know you wanted to kind of give us some perspective before we really get into the details of his story.
To start, I first came across him in a photograph from a woman's archive, a wedding. It didn't turn out well, the wedding, but right smack in the middle of the best man, Benito Mussolini. The New York Times in 1926, June wedding, called it a fascist wedding in Rome. And there we have the bride, nice-looking, comely American Jewish girl from New York City. And just to the left, we have the groom, Attilio Teruzzi, whom I didn't recognize at first. So it wasn't so much the problem of finding out the bride. I have her pictures, we'll go on. But I had to end up, where is the man? Who is the man? She was easy to see, to find, her photographs, a nice Jewish girl who then became a young opera diva in Italy, where she met her soon-to-be husband. She was out to make a coup, very, very intelligent, talented young diva. And to go on further, the coup in her mind was to meet up with her fiancé, Attilio Teruzzi, who at that point had become a statesman, undersecretary of the minister. And here we have the happy power couple in 1926. So the question for me was, who was this man that he married this young American woman, Jewish, and what happened that the marriage broke up? But that took me then on a long search, often using photographs to figure out who he was, okay? He was, first and foremost, a colonial soldier background in Milan. Here we have, he wanted to be an officer and a gentleman, but he was in the colonial army. That's like the Foreign Legion in France, a very rough kind of group. Now, 1913, he had been in the army. His first 20 years, he was a very good soldier. Here we have him after a battle at Maharuga, which he's wounded, for which he gets a silver medal in the Italian war to conquer Libya, which began in 1911. Here he is with his arm, which had been shot, a big beard. This is a man who was always at war, which also shows that Italy was always at war, at least from 1911 on, except very rare times. So, okay, we can see first the wars fought in Libya. We'll see him in the Italian front in World War I. He's going to win 2 silver medals there. We're going to see him back in Libya, on the Libyan front in World War I. Nobody knows about that particular front. Then we're going to see him going up to fight the Reds in Italy. That was, they regarded as a war, the fascists against the subversives. And then we're going to see him as governor in the Second Italy Senussi War against the Senussi warriors in Libya. We're going to then see him moving on to the Ethiopian War, where he's going to be a militia general. And then we're going to see him in the Spanish Civil War, a secret so-called expeditionary force, which was very important to Franco and the Nationalists to winning the war. And that will be, for the moment, that will entitle him to say he was fought all the Italian fascist wars up until then. And finally, at the very end, we're going to see him in 1945 for several days, called up as a general to fight on the side of the Germans against the Allies and the partisans. But let's move on very quickly so you can see his physique, because this was what was regarded as a very handsome soldier. Here we see him in World War I on the Italian front, terrible war. He's with his general, a very good General Vaccardi, and another aide-de-camp. He's a captain, but he's become an aide-de-camp. Then after he is demobilized, he comes back, he's only a major. He would like perhaps to go further, but basically there's exuberant numbers of officers, and he's one of those who decides to go into the Reserve Corps because he's not going to advance in the army. And in any case, he sees the idea now is that the army now doesn't work. He will join the fascists and make them work like an army. And for the next 25 years, basically 20 to 1945, he's an unwavering fascist. Now you see him on the March on Rome. There he is right in the center, posing, handsome beard. Again, very photogenic. Camera often focuses on him as standing behind Mussolini as an aide-de-camp. He's not one of the 4 quadrivirs. He has led up a very vicious band of legionnaires coming out of the Emilia-Romagna area. In 1926, he's commander in the field in another Italian Senussi War. You could see him on this white horse with the Arabs being forced, sheikhs being forced to submit to the Italians. Here we see him, he's become the head of the fascist militia, 350,000 men, which is a huge force we'll come back to, with Mussolini and with his own general, who has now become the general in charge of the Presidium of Rome. So you can see now he's sort of transferred his allegiance from a long time past to Mussolini. You can see him here now. He's been promoted brigadier general in the army. Just flip back. Here he has become the Minister of Italian Africa in 1939, and he's retired at that point as Division General, Army Corps General, he becomes appointed that in 1938, and then he retires then because of age in 1939. He is the head of Italian Africa. He's with the Nazi colonial plenipotentiary, and he's in Berlin here. He's reviewing the Grossdeutschland Regiment, which has just come back from France and is about to head toward Eastern Europe. This is not a war he's actually involved in physically on the field. This is the war that's going down to take Italy way out of its immediate colonial ambitions, which are basically toward the Western Mediterranean and Spain, through the Mediterranean, and then down through the Horn of Africa. That was Eurafrica is what the Italians imagined that they were going to have in the way of empire, but they've joined now as of 1940, entering the war against France to join their fortunes to conquer all of Europe and join in and with voluntary and regular military troops with the Germans in the onslaught in 1941 against the Soviet Union. That will, of course, by then have proved the undoing of Italy and of the fascist regime in 1943. He is being denounced, very visible, as a notorious libertine, which he was, but more and more he's going to be public as the regime crumbles. He will be indicted as a kind of one of the most notorious collaborators of fascism. He is a purged hierarch. He's been tried, and the first big fascist to be tried. He has also the longest sentences, and he becomes basically the assistant librarian to the prison chaplain until he's released in 1950, whereupon he dies soon after. So just to have these in the back of your mind, we'll now turn the conversation over to Jason, who's going to ask more about this book, The Perfect Fascist.
Well, Victoria, thank you for that. That certainly has, I think, stoked our curiosity about Teruzzi and about his long career as a military man and then as a fascist. I thought I would ask very briefly, though, that this is quite a story. And you actually said several times in your overview about these are things that are unknown, either just him personally or those aspects of his life where he was a major figure in fascist politics. What drew you to this story about Teruzzi?
Well, it was finding this archive, but before that, I've been very interested in nailing a fascist, kind of driving the stake through the heart, revealing behind the facade, how they operated amongst each other, what kind of relations they had with women and with their children. Did they think this is going to go on? Did they buy houses? How did they imagine the future, not just politically or in terms of poor Italy's destiny, but in terms of their own? And so the archive gave me the insight to try to now go and pry into every nook and cranny to bring him out and to sometimes to out him, because he had been very much concealed for all kinds of reasons. Partly his character, he probably he would hide things. He wasn't a big writer. He was regarded as a reserved person. He shifted bureaucracies, and maybe too, as a military man, he wanted to keep a low profile in terms of diaries and such like that. That was part of his training, not to leave stuff around that could be found by prying eyes.
Well, you certainly do drag him into the light with this book. And, you point out, I think, here about we should not lose sight of the fact when we're looking at the leaders, the Mussolinis or the Hitlers, etc., of fascist movements, that those leaders always depend on lieutenants, on subordinates to make sure things run, that things are done. And Teruzzi is a key player in the Mussolini dictatorship, as you show. But I thought we would just move through his career and kind of flesh out what you presented to us initially in those slides. So, Victoria, could you tell us a bit about Teruzzi's background before he became a professional soldier?
Yeah, the Italian army in sort of around 1900 was an army that had relied very much on aristocracy. But as the militarization heated up in the late, in the 90s, and Italy's sort of wiggling, it's joined with Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and then there's France, and development of this alternate alliance. It needs more capabilities. And so this guy comes from a small background, a petty bourgeois background, who wouldn't have had either the education or the family monies to go to military academy, and was probably in trouble because he had a very impetuous character, and there were all kinds of sort of left-wing anarchist rebellions, mainly among young people in the 1890s in Milan. He was pretty sophisticated. That is, comes from a popular neighborhood, what they today call the Navigli. He volunteers. The idea that, hey, he'll become an officer, low-level officer. He'll spend his 12 years in the army and then get some sort of sinecure. They put them in the railroads management or so on. And so that's what happens. He joins the Foreign Legion. That would probably be more interesting, more career possibilities. And he's a cunning guy as well as impetuous. And he gets along with people. So he's helped to go to the Italian West Point, the Academy of Modena. He's sort of a regular guy who manages to get in. And that's the beginning of his career. That enables him to get a commission, goes back. And so he's making his way slowly. Let's say he's got good accounting abilities. He's the kind of guy you'll trust with the company monies and with the company diaries, but he's not going to become a general, that's for sure. There's no sign of that. He's in the infantry. And he's brave. There's no question he's brave. He throws his body onto the line and he gets medals. And that's what enables him to get involved with this very fine general, to get up so close to him, to have him really count on getting those men to go over the top, which was the main problem which you had in the in World War in the Italian front, in these terrible alpine circumstances, men being killed all over the place, your junior officers dying like flies. So Teruzzi is already in the period of, he's a military man, he's going to get up to be a major, right? And he's a very good soldier. That seems to be the case from the records.
Well, you've already kind of opened up the next question I was going to ask you about is his actual military service. And that takes us into a couple of conflicts that are just not that well known to many Americans, which is Italy's colonial war in Libya against the Ottoman Empire, and then within that new colony itself, that there's a kind of internal conflict that he gets involved with. And then, of course, he will then move to Italy proper during World War I. And a lot of us just don't know, Victoria, that much about Italy's participation in World War I. We much more familiar typically with France and Britain and that Western front. But that front there between Italy and Austria-Hungary, later Germany is involved, is an incredibly bloody one that you describe quite powerfully in the books. Can you tell us a bit about his service in these conflicts?
Well, in Libya, poor Libya, it's in the crossfire between the Ottomans, the Italians, the French and the British then pressing in from Egypt. It's a targeted area, which this rich coastline and these cute little cities of Tripoli and Benghazi. And of course, we think of it with horror. We hear the name Benghazi and it inspires this revulsion. We know about Gaddafi, but it was constantly. It was the last colony snatched from the Ottomans very late 1911, when Italy said, hey, we need a piece of this cake. The French have it, the British have it, now us, we're big, we want to be big there. So the Italians are using always Ascari troops from Eritrea, and that's where he comes in. He's ahead of a very handsome battalion of native troops, the Italian native so-called indigenous troops. The Italians had never seen such things. They're also fighting alongside of Italians. So it's a very exciting moment. This is the great exciting war, which the Italians used to call the Great War. That was their big entrance onto the scene of military life. They were going to start there, gradually conquer the rest of what they call the fourth shore, conquer the rest of the Mediterranean, maybe get the French to give some stuff. Maybe the British would recognize them and sort of gradually expand, they hoped, along the northern coast of Africa. So that's already part of the start of World War I, as those of you who are war buffs, the wars, and which then weakens all the Ottomans. So you get the first Balkan Wars, the second Balkan Wars. It's a very part of that trajectory. Teruzzi then is brought in, like all of the colonial people, they're shifted over to this northern front along the Austrian, and they hope they're going to win the war right away. They're going to knockout blow, zoom, get to Vienna, and that will be it. They're going to get back those lands that are some Italian speaking, some German, and instead this becomes trench warfare, except that it's trench warfare, 2,000 meters up in the air, 6,000, 7,000 feet. And this is especially so when in the second year of the war, actually, it's a little like the Marne, the Battle of the Marne, and then the Somme, when the Germans launched this huge expedition over the mountains, and they catch the Italians unawares. And so then the Italians have to push back, which means just this terrible bloody warfare, both in the north on the Alpine and then on this river that's the Carso, which is a flat plain. So it's as bloody as any front, and it's immobile as any front that was, and they had as many decimations as probably now it's being argued as even maybe as the Russians, though I'm not quite sure if that's true or exaggerated, but it was a hugely sad and war that was fought. And then the Italians saw that the Libyans were reconquered Libya. And so they had to start thinking, oh my gosh, there's going to be the peace treaties and we've lost now this colony. We're on the edge. We've been driven back to the little towns on the water. So they began to send back officers there to try to mobilize so that when Italy went to Versailles, to the peace treaty, they could say, hey, we have conquered Libya, now recognize this is ours. And so he's a small figure in that because as a major, he's made a brigade major, a battalion major, in this little town of Darna, and serves in until he comes home in 1920. So they're there. The Italians are very militaristic starting in 1911 and then continuing to 1920, and then wanting more when the peace treaties say, hey, you can't have this, you can't have that.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point about this militarization of Italian politics, of Italian society that happens in that decade of conflict, 1911 to 1920, that you just mentioned, Victoria. And I think it's important that you note in the book that 689,000 Italians perished in World War I. That's a staggeringly high number. It's obviously 1.5 times the number of all Americans killed during World War II. And Italy doesn't even join until the spring of 1915, and how bloody this was, and you draw our attention to that in those sections of the book about Teruzzi's involvement. And then he, as you mentioned, he comes home in 1920, and of course the country itself is convulsed by political unrest. And I thought we would say something about that here. Can you describe the situation in Milan at that time that he comes back, and how he becomes involved with Benito Mussolini?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can imagine this guy who'd been very happy in Libya, a beautiful little town. He had a girlfriend, battalion major. He was the head of everything, and comes back in Milan, and there's been big strike waves. The workers are trying to get higher wages, unionize. The peasants out in the countryside are occupying the land. Said, hey, we fought in this army for 3 years. We've made so many sacrifices. Give us some dignity at home. So there's this huge amount of social unrest. And then there's a lot of antipathy against the war. Most Italians did not support the war. They wanted Italy to remain neutral during the war. They didn't see why they should be involved in this conflict. And so the country had split between those who supported the war and those who were against it. And that was particularly visible in Milan, which in the first elections after the war got a renewal of a socialist administration, social reform administration. So he comes home, workers on strike, a socialist administration, which basically had been neutralist, if not anti-war, and the streets are filled with people who are insulting the officers, saying it was their fault, insulting, if not them personally, their uniform. And it was a discovery for me, this idea that an insult to an officer's insult to the king's uniform, and they were just furious at this illegality, at this this notion that they represented the Constitution and the nation and the king, and the sacrifices for the war should be so insulted and treated so badly. They said also by the army, which was now demobilizing them, by the government that wasn't providing them with good pensions, by the people who didn't recognize their service, didn't even set up a kind of Veterans Day for them to honor their involvement in the war. So there was a huge amount of animosity, especially at that level, at the officer level. And he, being impetuous, being a Republican in the Italian sense, that is anti-monarchical, being at that point also anti-clerical, this guy, was really angry and very visible. He would act it out, stand around with his arms crossed and, rage at the, in the center of the town, the big piazza, the Galleria. He was very visible because he had beautiful blue uniform of the colonial army, not the khakis of, the normal officers, and a lot of medals and so on. So, he really does become a kind of embodiment of that particular kind of anger. Why, however, big question, he should shift his loyalties from the army and this gorgeous general he had who was so honest and so, righteous and so on, to Mussolini. That's the question I had to really keep asking, why that shift over. It's not, as we know from our military, it's not self-evident that they're going to shift from being in the ranks to politics. It's a big, different world.
Right. You do sort of talk about military and paramilitary in the book, these kind of militias really that the fascists create and mobilize, and Teruzzi has such a role to play in those that we'll get to. You describe Teruzzi as, quote, one of the most visible and vigorous new men of the fascist revolution. Could you explain for the audience what you mean by this, and say a little bit about the different hats he wore in the early fascist movement?
Yeah. Well, fascism gathered in an amazing elite. We can't underestimate that. Mussolini, in the first period, surrounds himself by fascists like Teruzzi, and we'll come back to him because he's very important here, but he also gets the best and the brightest of the old nationalists. Can't quite think of a comparable person. It would be, it's like some of George Bush's counselors, like Baker, people who were constitutionalists, but let's say nationalists. And he gets, very smart economists around him, gets brilliant philosophers to become the ministers of education. So, it's an interesting grouping that he gets together when he starts out. But among the fascists, Teruzzi plays a particular kind of role because he looks good in uniform. A lot of generals don't look good. I mean, they're bent over, big, loose uniforms, and there he is. When I say vigorous, and he, had a lot of girlfriends, and he was real fisticuffs. This is a guy who threw punches and kicked people in the rear if they were, socialists. He's physical. That was a surprise. And you say, guys, he's 38 years old. Is he running around beating people up and doing this and that? Yeah, he's physical. Like the way these colonial officers treated their colored troops. They kick them around, and they were supposed to beat them, and they were supposed to show their physical command over them. And so he had that physicality to throw himself around. So that's the vigorous, new. These are coming from the lower middle classes. There was no respect for them in the political life of Italy. They had not been involved in politics. Mussolini had been involved in socialist politics and been the director of their Socialist Party newspaper. Teruzzi, he had been in the army. He couldn't be in politics. I still couldn't even find if they voted, because they're supposed to stay out of politics. In any case, most people didn't vote until the 1920 elections. The electorate was very, very small. So these are the new men on the scene. They create a lot of disorder, but they're supposed to restore order. They keep saying, we're going to be efficient government. We're going to get rid of the Reds, who are enemies of the country. We're going to make Italy great. Very clear. We're going to make it as strong and beautiful as it was under Roman times. That's the refrain. We're going to make it a major power. We're going to build a fleet, to compete with the French and the British in the Mediterranean. So this is the kind of man that he's one of, though he's one of the not regarded as educated because he doesn't have a college degree, and also because he's an organizer, and there's kind of prejudice against organizers. There's much is made about the thinkers of fascism, and not very little attention is paid to those who are actually organizing the squads, which is not simple. It's very hard to take ruffians and shape them up into militia. It takes a certain military capacity. And so that's why he's very important and peculiar in the early fascist movement, because he is a military man and knows how to organize.
You have this priceless quote, Victoria. I'm sorry?
No, please, that was not a...
Oh, no, I just said that you have this priceless quote from Mussolini where they're trying to organize these militias, these squads, to intimidate opponents. And Mussolini says, I can, for the life of me, I'm paraphrasing, but for the life of me, I can't figure out how Trotsky actually created a Red Army in Russia. And obviously Teruzzi, as you detail, plays a big role in holding these elements together. His own personal charisma and his own background as a soldier really does help, with that. And that actually leads to this next point about, speaking of intimidating and worse political opponents, is that you draw our attention to the murder in June 1924 of the Italian socialist Giacomo Matteotti. And this was a real turning point for the Mussolini regime. Could you tell our audience a bit about this murder, about Matteotti's murder, Teruzzi's complicity or not in it, and why this was such a decisive moment for the Mussolini regime?
Yeah, so you all have to think for a moment that Mussolini is appointed prime minister in October 1922 by the king to head up a new cabinet, because the government is a parliamentary system, and they had no other man could form up a cabinet that would last. They kept turning over. So Mussolini gets there by playing a double role. He's sort of going through the piazza, beating people up, the March on Rome as a kind of blackmail. But at the same time, all of these dealings are made to say, okay, now you try to be the prime minister. And he comes there and he is it. So then the problem becomes, how is he going to rule? It's one thing to be the prime minister, but how are you going to keep the things going when you're there in a legitimate, semi-legitimate way? So postpones elections for 3 years until 2 years really, and finally there are the elections, okay? And he manages with a lot of violence to win. But at the same time, there's a lot of opposition that's developed in the country as well, and they've kept dealing with it, the fascists, by beating people up, by killing key people, mayors of important towns, deputies that are beaten up. And the one moment is in 1924 when they have to ratify the vote, which is an important part, with all the illegalities of the vote, the election law, which loaded it in favor of the fascists. And in Parliament, who speaks? This Matteotti, who's the prince of the opposition. I mean, say prince, he's a handsome man. He speaks English, he speaks French. He's looking into scandals, corruption scandals, American oil companies trying to buy favors. And he speaks. And it's said that Mussolini says, get rid of this guy. And a few days later, he is kidnapped and he resists and he's killed. So it's as if all hell would break loose. American newspapers, all the newspapers of the West are denouncing Mussolini for this murder. It's just one of those flagrant kinds of deeds. And the big question then is, will he survive? And it seems like he won't, except that ultimately there's quite a cover-up. Everybody, and the judges don't know how to get behind the cover-up. They kept being moved around. The magistrates investigate. And Mussolini himself doesn't know what to do. He falls sick. But in the end, it's this militia that rallies, and they come to him and say, you keep going. They basically come to Washington, they come to Rome, they enter his chamber and says, stop hanging around, malingering, act. And at that point, then he says, okay, tomorrow when I enter Parliament, I'm going to say, the dictatorship has arrived. Suck it up, folks, which is what he does. And in that point, Teruzzi's behind the scenes. He's not a major actor, but he certainly wants to let Mussolini know that the men are behind you. If you act, okay, we'll support you. And you have to act. Otherwise, we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to start the revolution up again. So it's a very key moment where Mussolini will act, and the army says, okay, we'll give you weapons because we're afraid the Reds will start up again. The king says, but, Jesus, if I take out Mussolini, who am I going to put in? The church says, well, we're neutral. We're not going to do anything, even though we condemn the murder. And so all the industry says, oh my God, the lira is going to not collapse, but certainly do very, very poorly. So the forces of order are willing to say, we'll go with you. And that begins the next stage. It's a long history, but it's sort of, the dictatorships go in phases, and you keep saying, my God, that could be the moment that it would fall. Oh no, that would be the Depression, another bad moment. Maybe he will fall, and so on and so forth. And pretty soon, 22 years of power.
Yeah, it's quite a story you tell there, Victoria, about how Mussolini, with support and the pushing of people like Teruzzi and some of the more radical figures in the fascist movement, and emerges from this scandal, from this debacle, more powerful than ever. And it's a more visibly authoritarian regime, right, that you show comes out of this crisis in 1924. And that actually then leads into this big moment in Teruzzi's personal life in the mid-1920s. You've already shown us a few slides of that, and that's the central part of your story is Teruzzi's courtship of and marriage to the American Liliana Weinman. What do you think about their relationship reveals about the personal and the political, that kind of rich phrase, the personal and the political in fascist Italy? What does it tell us?
Well, Mussolini wanted those guys to settle down. Okay? Teruzzi was very visible. He had girlfriends. One got pregnant. He was running around, and he was at wit's end. He didn't have any capital. He was getting now free apartments. He was fiddling around with small corruption, and he's spending his nights out on the town with ruffians, including a major radical fascist, a guy named Teruzzi. Farinacci, who had a lot of sway over him. So Mussolini was basically telling these guys, settle down. And how do you settle down? Create a family. The guy's been in the army. And so then who is he going to settle down with? And he sees this divine creature walking through Milan. He'd apparently followed her for several years, but now he has the courage because he's become a big shot, invited to become Undersecretary of State, which means he manages the police all over Italy. And so he feels now empowered to court this woman. And what does she bring? Well, big size. He likes big women, like his mother, ballast to keep him, in order. He wants that. He wants to be a moral man instead of, messing around. Money. Her father is supposed to be and is a capitalist, American. And at that point, everybody's saying, "Oh, Wall Street." Anybody who's an American capitalist is as rich as, as a Croesus. And then she's very moral, idealist. She thinks fascism is great, and she thinks he will be great if he's not so manipulated. So it's a marriage of like-minded people, of somebody who wants to veneer himself, but also cultural capital and real capital. So this becomes a marriage in which two people who say they love each other, hey, we can't doubt that, who seem to who seem to be mismatched, but in fact are well matched. She's young, 26. He's almost 40. But Italy, that was a kind of possible marriage, especially if the woman was bringing in a big dowry, as she did. So perfect marriage, it seemed, which he needed to present himself to the world, have children, act like a normal person. Otherwise, he would be considered a rogue, or, who knows, something worse. There's a lot of homoerotic relations amongst these fascists, and he wants to make clear that he's a married man with a big wife, full of virtues, like Mussolini's major lover and mentor, Jewish, Margherita Sarfatti, who performs the same function for Mussolini, telling him what to wear, writing speeches for him, advising him during the Matteotti crisis. So it does seem like a marriage, well, we could say made in hell, but made in heaven, hell in fascist Italy in 1926. And that's sort of where I come into the story. That, wow, he needed that. You can't just be a fascist. You need to have a personal life that's solid. Mussolini did, no matter how many lovers he had several children, one wife. Didn't matter that he had a harem. He was still showed to be a father of a big family. There were no scandals. People kept it silent that he had this person and that person, or it all redounded that he was a real macho guy, which is what was good in a vigorous fascist leader, youngest prime minister in all of Europe and in the world at that point. So Teruzzi's part of that, but he had to get married. That was the key.
It's such a revealing part of the book, this relationship, and about fascism's public face and the kind of morality that is a kind of morality that's cultivated by the regime, and how their relationship really is discloses a lot about that. Just watching our time here, Victoria, and I know that during the Q&A we could come back to talking about Teruzzi's return to Libya and his involvement in the Spanish Civil War. But looking at our time, I know our viewers would be very curious to know about how he looked at fascist Italy's growing ties to the Nazi regime, starting in the mid-1930s, obviously the most viciously anti-Semitic regime in the world, and how those ties obviously pull Italy into World War II. What was Teruzzi's place in that story?
He went along. It doesn't seem like he ever had any, he was anti-British. He was never philo-French, which some fascists were. Some were also British. He had taken his honeymoon in Germany. I think that probably matures, from 37. He's like Mussolini. These Germans, they're organized, they're rich, they have ambitions like us to overturn Versailles. And by the time he's Minister of Africa in 1939, they really are admiring of the Germans, and the Germans are admiring of the Italians. They're creating this cultural axis, mutual admiration society. You've got Wagner, we've got Verdi. You don't associate them with fascists, but that's how they, we dealt with one another. You have great writers, we have great writers, we have Machiavelli, you have raison d'etat, sort of this realpolitik. So we're perfectly matched. To take over the world, to take over Europe, first of all. The French are weak and impotent. The British don't even care about Europe. So there was that kind of mentality. The Russians are going to invade us and are barbarians. So the destiny is with the Germans and the Italians. Again, that's hard for Americans to think about. So, I would say this is a man who by 1940, is visiting Germany. He's coming back saying, hey, the Germans are with us. We're going to have a bigger empire than we thought once we go into the war on the side of the Germans. The colonial lobby is saying, oh my God, if we go in on the side of the Germans, we're lost. How can we protect our empire in East Africa and in North Africa from the British? They're all over the place, even if their army is smaller than ours, which it was in 1940. Italy didn't have the resources to do that. So Teruzzi is deeply misbegotten, like many people around Mussolini and Mussolini himself, to think that this axis is going to lead to the results they want. Quite the contrary. It's a totally misbegotten bet that they're making on a quick end of the war. Britain will fall out as a result of Germany's bombardment. U.S. stay out of the war. The Soviets are weak, and the Germans will take care of them. Terrible, terrible mistake, but that's a so-called mistake that comes from a dictatorship, which is more and more bellicose and more deluded about its place in the world.
Well, that's so interesting, and it leads me to this final question, then, Victoria, and then we're going to see what our audience would like to ask you. But how does World War II end for Teruzzi? Obviously, as Mussolini is ousted in the summer of 1943, and then the Germans have to kind of prop him up in this sort of puppet regime in northern Italy while they're occupying the country, and then this left that had been basically crushed in the early 20s is resurgent in much of northern Italy right late in the war. These partisan groups that form and openly challenge the fascists. What happens to Teruzzi as fascist Italy's war effort crumbles?
Well, he's ousted with the rest of Mussolini in July 43 after the Americans and the Allies invade Sicily, and he is forced to leave. The Germans first he's arrested, and the Germans rescue him when they rescue Mussolini with the idea of setting these guys up in the north. Well, the only one who really works out, so even though is Mussolini, nobody else wants these hierarchs. A younger, much more radical, furious, pro-Nazi fascist who's set up in the north. They don't want this old hierarch around, corrupt, with his personal problems. He has a Jewish companion who doesn't have citizenship, and a beautiful blue-eyed Aryan-looking child. And so he has to hide this woman from the Germans. He doesn't have his military pension. So there he is, sort of. And he's still with Mussolini. And he's with Mussolini to the very end, 1945. One last hurrah. He mobilizes a militia unit to try to escape to Switzerland, and he's caught. And that's sort of the end of it, the active story. And very lucky that he's not hung up in Piazza Loreto along with Mussolini and several other hierarchs. And that may be thanks to the fact that he was traveling with his wife and his girl, paramour, spouse, let's call her, and this terrified 6-year-old child who, would melt the heart of even the cruelest communist partisan. So they didn't shoot him right on the spot.
Well, when I was reading your book, Victoria, I kept thinking as this unfolded that he was going to be executed. So there is a bit of a twist there that he does survive, as you point out. It's incredibly,
Spoiler, it's a spoiler. Read the book, right. Forget what I said.
That's right. And there's 5 years of his life, obviously, that you detail too after the war's end. But I thought I would now open things up after this great conversation, Victoria, and let our audience pose some questions to you. And we've got several of them already. So I thought I would just start out here. This takes us back to the early 20s. Mike asked if you could elaborate a bit on this anti-subversive war that Teruzzi was involved in.
It's a very good question. That's my term to call it the anti-subversive war. Sometimes they call it a civil war, but the socialists and the communists were not organized. They basically sort of barricaded themselves inside of these buildings, like YMCA type, socialist YMCA type buildings, to try to keep, the fascists from, often allied with local police, and from bombarding them. So, but the language that they were enemies of Italy, that they were the Reds, they were Bolsheviks, that they had defeated the country during the war. That was a powerful metaphor that made Teruzzi be willing to mobilize squads protected by the police to go out and burn down the left organizations. The weakest left organizations, those that were most reformist, were Catholic organizations, which were also targeted. So what I call the anti-subversive war, they're using all the military tactics they can. There was even one idea to bombard the New Socialist newspaper with a airplane, bringing bombs. They were able to get military supply. They used trucks from military materiel left over. There was a kind of flowing out of military equipment, a little like from our wars, that the police get more and more militarized, and the squads, though in this case, were those which were picking up all this military materiel to use to attack the left. And they were real army-type maneuvers of the paramilitary in the big, rich valleys that, like around Bologna, around Milan, which is where the main battle. So the fascists were in battle everywhere that there were socialist organizations. You could take a map. Where's socialism strong? In the sense of voting locally, nice these institutions, and there you'd get these squads, which were by by the eve of the March of Rome, and occupied many of the town councils, the administrations. They'd actually had coups, many local coups. That was something I discovered that nobody's talked about. They've taken over and literally defenestrated. They would just throw the socialists out the window of the town councils where they had been legally elected, and that was very scores and scores of those events had happened. So that's what I call the anti-subversive war, to try to keep the idea of war here, war there, war there, war there, including this home front war.
Your account definitely raises all kinds of questions too about how the left failed to really respond to the fascist challenge in an adequate way. And those chapters of the book, or the sections of the book, are especially rich there. Since you've already mentioned the March on Rome, Victoria, we have a question from Thomas, who wanted to know a bit more about Teruzzi's own role in the March on Rome. What exactly he did during the march.
Yeah. Had to tease it out. So the March on Rome is kind of a really amateur hour military event. They're going to surround Rome, bring in legions from 13 different points, gather, start, over Perugia, then maybe Tivoli, something, Monte Rotondo, sort of surround the city of Rome. And that, they said, if the army doesn't intervene, will force the king to appoint Mussolini. And it was also allow the fascists to blow off steam. Otherwise, if they just appointed Mussolini and all these fascists are waiting to get power, it would have been, pretty complicated. So Teruzzi's role there is he, by that time, is the vice president of the fascist party. So he's in charge of liaising with all of the local groups. There are, however, 4 quadrumvirs, 4 leaders who are appointed to manage the overall strategy. And Teruzzi is put in charge of one of the legions, one of the biggest legions, which is Emilia-Romagna, which it's hard for me to say how many, probably maybe 4,000 men, which, again, assault Bologna, take over the jails, take over the trains, take over the post office. A coup type action, and then continue the march down. And he, meanwhile, is rushing around, doing various oversight kinds of tasks. So it's a paramilitary action, but with the idea that, hey, we are behaving in a military way. The main thing that happened is that the king did not call out the army to declare a state of siege, which the chief of staff did want to do that. He said, call out the army, these guys will disappear like snowflakes in the sun in the spring, which would probably be true. But it was a double action. It was Piazza and Parliament working this double action. So Teruzzi is convicted on that count that he helped organize the March on Rome, the coup. That's one of the indictments against him.
Well, looking at our time, Victoria, I think we have time for one more question, and it's actually been raised by 2 or 3 people from your presentation, which is about, since Teruzzi had a Jewish companion, how did the 1938 anti-Semitic laws that the regime passed, obviously under pressure from the Nazi regime, how did those laws affect him personally when these were implemented?
So real quick, his wife was trying to get an annulment, and the church said they did annul the marriage. Again, I'm not going to spoil anything here, because she was Jewish and American, and they didn't believe in real marriage like the Catholics did. Okay. His girlfriend, he tries to get her citizenship and fails. Later on, she would become more and more Jewish as a result of those laws, with many consequences. He himself, like many big fascists, wrote to Mussolini, said, "Oh, I met a poor Jewish widow in Genoa, and she's crying because she may have to leave Italy as a result of these laws. Can you do something?" And Mussolini says, "Oh, of course, she can stay. She shouldn't worry." So, the way these fascist laws are put into effect, they affect him. On the one hand, allow him to be more benevolent. On the other hand, it seems that he's going to be able to annul his marriage to his Jewish wife. And third, things will happen. He'll try to slip through the laws by getting his girlfriend, the mother of his daughter, citizenship. Life, humanity.
Well, there is certainly a lot about human beings that people will think about once they read your book, Victoria, and I strongly encourage them to get a copy of The Perfect Fascist, A Story of Love, Power, and Morality in Mussolini's Italy, out with Harvard University Press. Let me thank you, Victoria, for a fascinating conversation today. Such a rich work, and I think you've helped us understand better the dynamics of fascism as a movement and as a regime. So I hope people follow up and learn more about the story of Teruzzi and of the movement this notorious, violent movement, authoritarian movement that he was a part of. And let me thank our viewers for joining us this morning. With that, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we hope to have you again with us for one of these great discussions.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please consider visiting nationalww2museum.org/podcasts for more episodes. Again, that is nationalww2museum.org/podcasts. This series is made possible by the Albert and Ethel Herstein Charitable Foundation, which supports content like this from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Don't forget to rate and subscribe. It goes a long way to helping others find this series. I'm Jeremy Collins, signing off.